Now, as you know, it all began in Minneapolis, but has since spread across the U.S. And now the George Floyd death has sparked global protests against police brutality and chanting Black Lives Matter in London, Berlin, all over Europe and elsewhere, all the way down in New Zealand. Hundreds of protesters took to the streets calling for justice and joining the fight against racism. So to discuss these protests and the roots of racism, we will talk to our panel today. Former UK MP George Galloway and Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, host of On Contact, Chris Hedges is joining us. So first, over to George. George, we saw protests across London, all the way across to Cardiff, but those in the UK seemed peaceful. Were they? And are there similar sentiment about police brutality over there in the UK as well?
Amongst black people, there certainly is. No policeman has ever really been brutal to me, but then I've got blue eyes and a white face. That's not the lived experience of many of the black people in big cities in Britain. And that's true, of course, across the European continent. So the demonstrations in Britain have been big, even in my own home city of Dundee, a small city, 180,000 people, which hasn't had a demonstration that I've known of since I left it 35 years ago, has a demonstration this evening. Amsterdam, a very peaceful place, had a gigantic demonstration today. This has all been fatal for America's soft power in the world, Manila. The idea of Mike Pompeo and Donald Trump giving orders, instructions, advice as to how other people in other countries should live and should run their own countries is actually laughable now if it weren't so tragic. There was a poll today in Europe. 40% of the respondents said America was a very racist country. Another 40% said it was fairly racist country. Only 4% answered that America wasn't racist at all.
Wow. Chris, here domestically leading up to this, we saw the Ahmaud Arbery killing. We saw the Breonna Taylor, the EMT, killed in her own home. This was a tinderbox waiting to spark, wasn't it? And George Floyd was that spark. Why?
Because of the systematic forms of racism and oppression that have squeezed and put tremendous stress on the lives of the poor, the working poor, and in particular, those people trapped in what Malcolm X called our internal colonies. Half the country lives in poverty or a category called near poverty. The poor are priced out of the healthcare system. The public schools don't function. They don't have adequate food. We had rampant food insecurity before the pandemic, clean water, constant evictions, the largest prison system in the world, privatized utilities that can be shut off, lack of employment, crippling debt peonage. And of course, the pandemic has exacerbated all of this. Poor people of color are dying at disproportionately higher rates, and they get the message. So the message is they don't count. Their lives are of no consequence, unless, of course, they're locked in a cage where their bodies can generate $60,000 a year for our for-profit medical services, food services, money transfer services, commissary services, phone services, private prisons, et cetera. And I think that what we're seeing is not just another rising up against the wanton and indiscriminate murder of a black man. Remember, 1,100 people, almost all poor people of color who are unarmed, are murdered every year by police in this country. But I think that, finally people have had enough. I think that's what we're seeing, and that's why it's rippled out across the country.
And George, much of the mainstream media in the U.S. reported the protests in Hong Kong as freedom supporters and essentially glorified them and their cause. But yet these protesters here aren't reported as righteous. They're looters, they're criminals. Is there a difference here?
Yes, it was the worst timing in political history when Donald Trump appeared in the Rose Garden to take a new raft of sanctions against China on the proximate cause of how China treats its protesters. On the very day, literally the very day, when from sea to shining sea, the United States was on fire. This is what I mean by the death of American soft power. The idea that the people running America are fit to tell other people in the world how they should handle their affairs is now patently risible. The point about the straw that broke the camel's back, of course, is that you never know when the last straw came. If you knew it was the last straw, you wouldn't load it onto the camel's back. But once you have loaded it and the camel's back is broken, it can never be put together again. Now, this didn't start with Donald Trump, far from it. In fact, Joe Biden and Barack Obama made the lives of black people, people of color in America, markedly worse than they were when they came to power. But somehow, the nakedness of the US administration in the face of this ugliness, which the whole world is watching, has really been a particularly toxic effect. Never could a group of more privileged men be seen to be fiddling while their country burned.
Chris, I want to pose the same question to you. How do you look at the mainstream media and how they're covering, compare and contrast for us, if you will, the coverage of the Hong Kong riots or protests versus the protests or riots here in the U.S.?
Well, that's nothing new. I mean, I was overseas for 20 years, so when I covered the war in El Salvador, we had Catholic priests who were murdered by death squads or the Salvadoran military backed by the Reagan administration, and it raised barely a ripple. And then, of course, there was a priest murdered by the communist government in Poland, and he instantly became a martyr. So, you know, all states, selectively use human rights abuses in countries of their adversaries to posit themselves as moral arbiters. You know, I want to just second what George said, that this is a systematic abuse that predates Trump. It even predates Obama. And what did the kleptocrats do in the midst of this pandemic? They tossed a few crumbs out of the windows of their private jets and yachts and palatial homes, and then handed $4 trillion in funds and tax breaks to oil companies, the airline industry, which alone got $50 billion in stimulus money and now says it's not enough, the cruise ship industry, the real estate industry, private equity firms, lobbying groups whose political action committees have given over $191 million in campaign contributions to politicians in the last 2 decades, even corporations that have moved offshore to avoid U.S. taxes. The whole, 85% of all of these programs under the stimulus package has gone to the wealthiest 0.1%. And we have watched Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world, whose corporation Amazon paid no federal taxes last year alone, add $34.6 billion to his wealth. $443 billion has now been added to the wealth of the billionaire class since the pandemic began. And I think all of that myopia, that inability to respond, is also an important part of what we're seeing in terms of these uprisings.
And real quickly, gentlemen, I want to pose this one last question to you both. We've seen in recent days this sustained protest movement happening all across the country. Russia is being brought into it. George, what are your final thoughts on that?
Well, I wondered how long it would be before any television station in the U.S. made that laughable allegation. And predictably, it was CNN, the very personification of fake news. And from the mouth of the Susan Rice, a former high-ranking official of the United States. She literally said with a straight face that this was coming out of the Russia playbook. I'm surprised that Trump isn't claiming it's coming out of the Beijing playbook. But either way, this obsession with Russia and with China on either side of the aisle in U.S. politics just makes the whole thing even more ridiculous, I'm afraid. These problems were grown in America and grown centuries ago in America. And they should be addressed and solved. I pray that they are solved in America. It's about time America stayed home and fixed its own problems.
Chris, final thoughts on Russia being a part of this?
Well, of course, the ruling elites aren't going to accept responsibility. Remember, they've gone after Antifa, which on the spectrum of violent terrorist groups is equivalent with the Boy Scouts. After Russia, they will look for any scapegoat they can. They will widen the social and cultural divides, which is largely racial, pitting white vigilante groups against anything to deflect responsibility from their own complicity. And let's be clear, the complicity of the Democrats and the Republicans in creating this oligarchic state and orchestrating a corporate coup d'etat.
All right. Gentlemen, thank you both for weighing in on this subject. George Galloway, Chris Hedges, thank you, gentlemen.